Sustainability in Soils. Peter Fahnestock is a very important part of the department. He also teaches our soil science class. And as you guys have realized, even if you're from the social studies background in this class, no soil, no nothing. It's like in the horse business, we talk about no foot, no horse. In the plant growing life situation, no soil, no nothing. You plant people can say it's all about the plants. You're wrong. It's all about the soil. If there's no living, active, happening soil, you have nothing. So Peter is the USDA soil scientist from City of Victorville office. Most of you probably don't realize that's even there. The Natural Resource Conservation Service, and he's going to give you a lecture on soil sustainability. So thanks for coming, Peter.
My pleasure. I'm going to use Neville's lecture for this class, but I probably will deviate very wildly from that, but we'll just use that as a starting point. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, Neville. It's great to have Matthew Huffine on the other end. He taught both my kids at various times. Both of my kids went to AAE, so it's kind of nice for me the first time to do this, to have that AAE connection. So welcome you AAE guys as well. And some of you in this class have already know me. Either Mr. Serrano knows me indirectly, Brian, and even Carlos have taken my classes before. So first of all, I'll start off with a plug for that. I think it really is a very good class to segue into almost anything else you might do in life. And as Neville said, without soil, he didn't actually say it that way, but very simply in 4 words, no soil, no life. There is no life. All the things that we do or that we expect or we take for granted, perhaps, none of that's going to happen if we don't have soil. So I actually see someone else who's taking my class over there. Welcome. So I got a good group here. So you guys got some people who are going to plug for me, I hope. But without soil, we really don't have anything. But it's not well understood. We sort of take it for granted. We kind of just treat it like dirt, which it really isn't. So what I want to do today is just, as I said, segue, kind of go off of Neville's lecture, and we'll hit some of the salient points on that. We'll talk about soil erosion. We'll talk about soil sustainability. We'll try to kind of bring it back to the high desert, to the Mojave. But some of the principles, actually all the principles that I'll talk about today, or all the ideas, or all the discussions that we have, will really relate to wherever you might be in the world. The principles are really universal. We just kind of tweak soil sustainability based on where we are, primarily because of climatic differences or urbanization, or how we're actually using the soils. So the lecture is titled Soil Sustainability, Tillage, Composting, and Natural Fertilizers. There's a lot of stuff in there. And I don't know how much time I have, but probably 45 minutes to an hour. I can talk for hours on all this stuff, so I'm going to have to be really quick. So what I'm going to first of all do is I'm going to zip past all this, and I'm going to come up to this part right here. What is soil? So briefly, for those of you who haven't really thought about it, what is soil? Soil is just the unconsolidated material initially, whatever's at the Earth's surface. It's what we walk on. It's what we build our houses on. And I'm getting off my X. It's what we build our houses on. It's what we use to grow our food. Pretty much everything that we do in life somehow relates to the soil. Without the soil, we really don't have really anything to start with. So it really is critical that we kind of understand what it is, how it develops, and how we manage it. And that's really the key to soil sustainability. So let's look at this first of all. Can I ask a question, Carlos? Do they have a copy of this lecture? Does Neville take? Okay. So you guys actually have this PowerPoint someplace. I'm assuming AAE does as well. All right. So you'll forgive me if I jump around a bit on it. But like I said, I'll try to sort of keep to this. So what is soil? As I just said, it's the unconsolidated material. There's 5 things there that are listed that actually are what are called the soil forming factors, the 5 soil forming factors. These are universal factors, and really those factors in combination will determine what kind of soil you'll have in any part of the Earth's surface. Okay? So if you cannot kind of understand those factors based on wherever you are, you'll be able to actually understand or make a good estimate or guess, even without digging a hole, what kind of soil you might have. So let's just go through those really quickly. The first one is parent material. Parent material pretty much is what rocks did the soil that we have, that we're standing on, that we're examining, what rocks did they come from? And all the soil originally started out as rocks. Rocks get broken down, they get weathered, and they get moved around by water and by wind, and they continue to weather, they continue to break down, and eventually, in combination with some of the other soil forming factors, they create soil. So that's real, and like I said, I'll go, there's a lot of stuff in here, and I just know myself, I know I'll talk an awful lot, and I have a lot to say, so just so I have plenty of time to get off topic, I'll try to zip through some of these really quickly. And I'm assuming that you guys can ask questions and stop me at any time, because if you've got a question, either I'm going too fast or there's something that I missed out that you guys might want to know. And I'm sure that's fine with me. So just stop me and we can go wherever you think is useful, so long as we're developing these topics. Climate is the second one. So you take the second soil forming factor. So you take climate, and climate pretty much is rainfall. If you think about climate, the most important influence is going to be rainfall, because as you guys know from other classes, without water moving through the soils, we don't really are even moving without water, period. We really can't do all the things that we expect to do. And so all the chemical reactions that make up our body, all the things that happen in the soil with plants growing and microbes living, all those environments that are created are based on having the fact that we have water. So we can go on and on about soil, but if all of a sudden we got rid of the water, the fact that we have soil, even that won't make any difference. So we really rely on soil, on water. But climate, and again, of course, there's also the warmth and the length of time between freezings and all that. But primarily, most importantly, it's water moving through the soil that's actually going to develop that soil, or water moving through that parent material. So that's basically the climate there. I'm afraid to get too much into that because, like I said, I'll go off on a tangent there. The third one is what's called biota, or the living organisms in the soil. They also contribute to soil development, but they also live and they die, and they contribute organic matter to the soil, which again you'll see is really important. But they also have a lot of functions in the soil. Topography is the fourth one. That is the shape of the land. What does the land actually look like? Is it flat? Is it mountainous? Is it tilt left or right? Does it face to the north or to the south? All those things have an influence on climate. For instance, one of the things that I talk about in my class, and I show pictures of it, is that in the northern hemisphere, if you have water falling on a north-facing mountain range and the same amount of water falling on a south-facing mountain range, you're going to have a lot different soil development and a lot different plant life, and your microbial populations will be different as well, for one reason and one reason only, because you've got a different exposure to climate. You've got a different exposure on the south-facing slope than you do on the north-facing slope. So you could take the same amount of water on a north-facing slope as you have on a south-facing slope, but yet more water will evaporate off that south-facing slope, meaning there's less water available for soil development, for anybody who wants to use that water, like plant growth, for microbes to live there. It's not going to be as favorable. But the same amount of water is falling off. The only difference is it gets more solar radiation. That ties right back into that whole climate factor, which I said these 5 factors all together create soils. So you can kind of see just by that, just the simple thing of which way the land is shaped. What about a land that is actually sloping, and the bottom of in another place nearby it's getting the same amount of rain, is actually more like a basin shape. So it's actually collecting all the water that runs down by gravity, same amount of water that falls on the land, but all of a sudden this area that's at the bottom is receiving more water because gravity is running water off. So if it can't go into the soil as fast as it would like, or as fast as it's coming down, then it's going to collect at the bottom. Well, the bottom of that slope, let's just say, is going to have much different soils over time, and that's the final one there, that's the last key, over time, than the side slope will have. So all those things kind of tying together. Let's look at the last one. The last one is time. So you take all those four factors before that, and you add the whole time factor to that, and over time, soils will begin to develop. So all 4 of those factors working for longer periods of time will result in a soil that's much more developed, that has more characteristics that are unique to it. It'll be less like that parent material that we talked about, that unconsolidated material. It'll be more like an individual unit or an individual person, just like I look out here and everybody is different, but yet we're all people. We're all humans. We all have different characteristics. And I can't really say that all the parent material and climate shaped how you guys look today, but in a sense, who we are inside is based on what we've experienced over time, right? So if you can kind of sort of like I know it's not a really good analogy, but stretch with me a little bit and help me out there. And see if that doesn't help you relate to how soils are formed. So that's pretty important. Let's move on from that quickly and say, what are some of the important soil functions? In my class, there's a whole, what we just did in like about 3 minutes there, we spend a whole lecture on, we spend about 2.5 hours on. So if you like that, or if you like, that's interesting, you got a place that you can get more of it. What important soil functions? If we just kind of read through them, the most obvious here is it's a medium for roots to grow in. So that's pretty important because I know we have hydroponics now, and some people say, hey, hydroponics are the answer to everything, but they're only the answer to a few things, some of which aren't legal. But mostly what we depend on the soil for is a substrate place for the roots to grow. The roots don't only need a place to grow to anchor, but they also are going to use that soil to get their nutrients. Without the soil, unless we supply it, say, hydroponically in the solution, the plants, they need more than just the soil. The soil helps them anchor in, but they need what else that soil can provide. The nutrients that can flow through the soil or that come from breaking that parent material down, those rocks down, further and further into the individual minerals that can recombine or can be utilized by plants. So I already said the second one, it's a reservoir for plant nutrients. So you've got two of them. It's a place for roots to grow, and it's also the source of a lot of the nutrients that plants need. Soil organisms, I mentioned that before, is one of the soil forming factors. It's a home for the soil organisms. They also help plant growth, and they do a lot of other things as well. Recycling of organic materials, that's also talked about. I'll let that one go. I won't discuss that one any more deeply. But how about the water cycle? You guys might remember probably from 6th or 7th grade where we talked about the water cycle in your science classes. The soils help regulate the water cycle, the whole hydrologic cycle. Without that, if you remember from that graphic, because I think there's a graphic out there, water falls from the sky, it lands on the soil, and it goes through the soil, and it gets cleaned up, and eventually it ends up to the ocean, where it evaporates into clouds and it moves off into the land and it does this whole thing. That's a very, very simplified version of that. But the most important part of that is when that water falls on the land from the clouds, from the sky, what happens then? What happens then? What does the soil do for that? So what? Is it just because it has to fall someplace so it falls on the soil? Or does the soil actually perform a function? Yes, because of gravity and whatnot, the water is going to fall out of the sky. It's going to fall towards the center of the earth, and it's et cetera, as we all expect. Just like if you jump out of an airplane, you're not going to float around in the sky. You're going to go straight down. So does the water. But when it gets to the soil, when it hits the soil, there's a number of things it's going to do. It may erode off because of the type of soil or maybe mismanagement or who knows what it might be. We'll touch on that briefly too. Or it might actually enter the soil where it becomes then used by plants. It can become purified. It can become, it can get down to the water table in many cases. But soil, the big thing that soil can do, other than providing a source for water as well, is that it can clean the water. And it actually does that. So again, without going into all that, we'll just move on from that. But like I said, there's always a place to learn more about these things. But there's a lot to talk about, so I'll just keep going. And finally, the last one here is that it's a substrate or it's a medium, an engineering medium. And what that basically means is that we use the soil. This building, AAE's buildings, they're all based on the soil. And the soil's functions, or the soil's characteristics, where you want to put a road, a golf course, a building, whatever it might be, the soil's characteristics of that location are going to determine what you might have to do to modify that. Can you just use the soil like it is? Or do you have to add something to it? Do you have to excavate it and mix it up with more clay? Is it got too much clay, or does it have the wrong kind of clay? If I add water into that soil, if it's got a certain kind of clay, will that clay shrink and swell as the water evaporates and goes back in? Because if that happens, I'm going to end up with cracked sidewalks, cracked foundations, maybe gas lines and things like that. That's not a good thing. So the soil acts as a medium. We use the soil, we compact the soil, we spread the soil, we use the topsoil for our gardens, etc. So the soil at a given location is an engineering medium. So when you think of engineering, think of it as more than just engineers. Think of it as what we would do, all of us would do with the soil. Okay, whether it's gardening, so for some of us that's the easiest thing to think of is gardening, or whether we really are scientists or road constructions or civil engineers, etc., where we're actually looking to build something or have the soil be a support for something else. Okay, let's see where we can go from there. All right, I think this is a good segue. So soil is a limited resource. We wouldn't have a soil science class if it wasn't worth talking about. And Neville wouldn't have asked me to come and speak to you folks as well. But soil is a limited resource, and the statistics that he has here is pretty much we have about a quarter of the globe's surface that could theoretically be farmed or could theoretically be used because the rest of it's water. So you've got a quarter of that, but he's basically saying that in this graphic that hardly any of that quarter of land surface on the globe is really ideal for producing food and fiber to support the human population. And that's, I think, where this lecture is really going. We're giving you a little bit of a background, tried to sort of bring you up to a little bit of this, at a common level, what soil really is. But really, this is critical. If you look at these numbers here, you begin to see that our population is growing. I mean, barring some catastrophic thing happening globally, our population is going to continue to increase. And we need to find better and better ways to, or not better ways, we need to find more efficient ways to feed people. Because no matter what you look at, whether you're into the green energy to power your cars, or whether you just, you want to just eat organic foods, that you need ground to do that. You need land surface to do that. If you go back and you think about where people like to build, where are most of the cities built? Well, from early civilizations, most of them are built by water sources, right? But even today, we see that we build things where it's easiest to build. And where is it easiest to build? Where things are flat. Right? Nobody's building, well, some people are because they got lots of money and they want to be remote, but by and large, we're not building lots of houses on the sides of mountains. Not steep slopes. It's too hard to get machinery up there. It's too hard to lay foundations and do all the kinds of things that you need to build. So people build on flatter areas, which just coincides to be the very best place to farm. So throughout the world, a lot of our good farmland, which is already minimized, has already been covered with concrete in one form or another. As I came down Bear Valley Road today, I saw them destroying one of those old buildings up there on the corner. So yeah, you can remove concrete. They're doing it up there, and they're doing it pretty fast. You can remove that, but that's a lot of work to do that. That's a lot of. You just can't reverse and take cities down and say we're going to turn them back into farmland. We all know that's not going to happen. So, what do we do with what's left? How do we maintain our soil sustainability? How do we keep feeding ourselves? How do we keep protecting the soil resource? And that, I think, is the key question. How do we protect our soil resource? We don't have to worry about advocate, we need to tear the cities down or anything like that. No, we just need to protect what we've got left, manage it efficiently, and to do that, we need to understand how soils form, how do we manage them, and how we can damage them. So let's go on and see what we can have. I'll slip past that one. Let's see here. Whoops, what did I do? Something bad. Okay, this is called, this graphic or this slide says soils are holy. So I'm not sure I'm going to go with this one, but it's important to understand that we're going to talk about some specific soil characteristics, and then I'm going to go back to the very beginning of this lecture where Neville talks about soil erosion, and I think that X needs to be moved forward by 2 feet. I keep finding I need to go that way. But let's talk about some characteristics of soils, all right? So this says soils are holy, but pretty much what that means is that soils have spaces between them. So again, a whole nother lecture here in about 2 sentences, but soils are composed of sand, silt, and clay. Those are what we call the 3 primary soil particles. If they're particles, that means that they have mass and they occupy space. So that means that they can't, if you've got one particle here, another particle can't exist on top of it or inside that same space, right? So they butt up against each other. Very simply, these soil particles, which all have their own very specific soil characteristics, are very specific characteristics, and give soils all those wonderful properties that we won't get to today. But the simplistic form is that sand, silt, and clay particles, they can butt up next to each other, but they can't occupy the same space. So if you think of sand particles, which are the largest, if you just imagine a whole bunch of marbles, right? You have a whole bunch of marbles in your hand, and you can have them flat in your hand, and they'll just kind of lay, if your hands are big enough, you might be able to hold 10 marbles in your hand, and they're not even touching each other. If you squeeze your hand together, you can squeeze those marbles together, right? But it doesn't matter how tight you squeeze your hand, at some point, those marbles are not going to go together anymore. But even if you're squeezing with all your might, if you're able to look at those marbles in your hand, you'd see that there's spaces between them because you can't compress them. That's what we're talking about, the holes or the pore spaces in soils, the spaces between those particles. Now, sand particles don't really compress, but silts and clay particles, they actually have the ability to slip because they're not regular shape. They're irregular shape. Some of them are flat or like pages of a book. They have the ability to slip past each other. They have to be able to move and to be able to get closer and closer and closer together. So what, you might say? Why is that important? Well, if you think about it, water and air are needed by plants to grow. Well, water and air can only exist where there's no sand, silt, and clay particles in the soil, right? So in those holy spaces or those pore spaces between those particles, that's where the air and the water is going to exist or is going to be. So if we have a sandy soil, we use the analogy of marbles, we may not be able to squeeze that together. So we may always have some pore space in the soil. But sand, without saying too much, sand is not really super desirable to grow plants in. It's got some really good benefits, but it's not ideal because it dries out really fast. So especially in an environment like the Mojave Desert, you have a soil that's very sandy, and you don't have a lot of water anyways, it's going to dry out pretty fast, and your roots are going to be suffering. Your plant's going to be suffering, so you got to continue to add water in it. You might want some more of those other particles which have characteristics that actually hold on to the water longer. They're actually able to hold onto the water even against the force of gravity, right? So gravity is always pushing down into the center of the earth, but when you get a small enough pore space, you can actually hold on to that water against the force of gravity inside that pore. Kind of like a straw. If you get a really fine straw and you hold your finger over the top of it, for instance, you can see that water will stay in there. But if you get a really small straw, like if you've ever had your blood taken and they put that little glass thing when they prick your finger or whatever, when they've got the blood into that little tube, it goes up the side of the tube, but gravity can't pull that back out there. So that's kind of like the pore spaces. If you get a small enough diameter pore, you can hold water in there, but the root can still extract a lot of that water. The root can still say, hey, I can get in there and take that out. Now, let's go back really quickly and talk about the importance of pore spaces for roots, for plant growth. As I said, you can't have solid objects occupying the same dimension, right? There's got to be space for everything. So by the same token, if you've got a soil particle, a root can't exist in the same place that a soil particle exists. So the only place that the water can go, and the only place that the air can go, and consequently the only places that roots can go are in the pore spaces. The pore spaces between the soil particles. And remember, the soil particles are sand, silt, and clay. So we really need to maintain those soil particles, the pore space rather, the spaces between those soil particles, because that's where life is going to actually exist, because it's not going to exist on the inside of that marble that we're talking about, or on the inside of that sand particle. All right, so pore space, holy soils, or porosity is really going to be critical, because that's where, by reminder, that's where air goes, water goes, and also where all the root grows. The roots themselves will go. So you can see that anything we can do to maintain that, or conversely, anything we can do to not damage that is going to be really critical. Because you can see that the productivity of a soil, even if it's a really good soil, the productivity of a soil can go down if you can't hold enough water in it for the roots to grow. So let's go on and see what's next. An ideal soil there, they're showing you about half of it should be pore space. 50% of it should be space for air, water, or roots. And the minerals, that's the soil particles, okay? And the mineral particles is the sand, silt, and clay. I think I just broke my, don't fiddle with the tools there. All right. Really quickly, we'll go on to these things, and then, like I said, we'll zip back to the beginning of this and try to get into the whole sustainability part. So soil texture, pretty much what is soil texture? What does the soil feel like? You pick it up in your hand, what does it feel like? Does it feel like it's gritty? Probably got a lot of sand in it. Does it feel like it's sticky? Probably it's got a lot of the soil particle clay in it. So how does it feel? That's pretty much what it is. So anybody can do this in my class. We talk about this, and I say that this is probably understanding soil texture. Once you go through, like if you go through a class and you get fairly proficient with doing soil texture, you can pretty much predict how soil is going to behave. You can even guess its fertility in some cases. Of course, you have to have eyes that work as well to be able to look around you to observe other characteristics or other things that are going on in that area. But knowing soil texture, you can pretty much predict how a soil will behave for whatever purpose it is that you want to use it for. All right, that's called the soil triangle, or here it's called the soil pyramid. All that basically is a tool for you to estimate how much of those particles you have, sand, silt, and clay. So the texture, let me just say finally, which I think I forgot to say, the soil texture, I said it's how the soil feels, but it is the proportion, how much you have of sand, silt, and clay particles. How much of each one of those do you have? What's the proportion of each? And that's what this textural triangle, or what's called the soil pyramid here, helps you to determine. You basically figure out how much sand you have by feeling it, how much clay you have, and you intersect those two. You get the silt by default, because everything has to add up to 100, and then it gives you a texture, it gives you a name like sandy loam or sandy clay loam. Okay, soil structure. Soil structure is primarily how the soil is arranged. So it's just kind of like, think about building blocks. Think about like a brick house. You can see the structure of a brick house. We got the bricks laid on top of each other, and then, you know, the space between them, we have another brick laid on that. That's the soil structure of a brick house. But soils have very distinctive structure as well. Structure also it's important because it also involves the pore space. It also influences how much pore space they have. We already talked about how important that is. When you have your soil particles, when you have a very young soil, let's just say that it's just been moved by water. It's down here in the Mojave now. You had a big flood and you moved a whole bunch of material and you dropped it down someplace. Well, now you have a brand new parent material, right? Because you've just, even if it was a soil at one time, you just kind of eroded it and mixed it all up and you moved it from point A to point B and dropped it down here. So now you have this massive material. It's got some sand, some silt, and some clay in it, right? If you give it enough time, remember our 5 soil forming factors, you're going to start separating that soil out into different layers, into different horizons, assuming that we don't disturb it again with another flood or something like that. And eventually what we'll do is we'll actually begin to develop structure. And as those different soil layers, which form horizontal to the surface, begin to develop over time, and water moves through that parent material and turns it into soil or creates a soil out of that, we'll see some very distinctive structures develop based on that. So again, I'm giving you a synopsis of the whole soil science class in this thing. So there's a whole lecture we can talk about that too. But it's very important to understand that when we destroy structure, we're also destroying the pore space. By and large, we're affecting pore space, and we're stopping the movement of air and water into the soil. And if we stop doing that, if we stop the air and the water from moving into the soil, we've got ourselves a real problem. And it doesn't really matter if we've got really good structure or really good pore space down here somewhere below the surface. If we can't get the water in through the upper 2 or 3 inches and it's eroding off because something has been done to the structure to damage it, you've kind of lost the battle for growing things and for actually having soil sustainability. Your soil, even if its potential is there, will not live up to its potential. Okay. I know I'm skipping through a lot of stuff. Soil chemistry is also another characteristic of all soils. It's going to vary. Very simply, the more clay you have in your soil, the more soil chemistry you have to talk about. Okay, sandy soils are pretty much chemically inactive. You go down to the beach, you imagine that as the ultimate sandy soil, if you will. Not very much going on there chemically. All right. As you increase the clay amounts in the soil, there's a lot more chemistry going on. Clays are super important because they provide 90% of the function of soils. So understanding soil or understanding clays is super critical for managing soils. This cation exchange capacity, CEC it's called, that's just a number or a measurement that estimates the fertility of the soil. Remember what I said, you can go back and knowing your texture, you can estimate, well, if I got a fair amount of clay in this, you can assume, it's not going to be true all the time, you can assume that your soil fertility is going to be decent, or at least the potential for soil fertility will be good. Your CEC numbers will be higher. Higher is better on this for soil fertility. You can also take every soil will have a pH, just like everything that we can measure has got a pH. For plant growth, for growing agricultural crops, as it said here, about 6 to 7.5 pH, right around either side of the neutral range, is really what plants like the best. In the Mojave Desert, we're going to be hard pressed to find 7.5. Most of our soils will be 7.5 at best, and they'll run up higher than that. So we have more of a challenge here in this environment, in this dry environment, where we've collected materials, minerals, rather than flush them through because our rainfall is very low. So we end up having the pH raised. The main way that our pH gets raised in the Mojave or in dry areas of the world is through carbonate dust. Comes out of the playas, blows up in the atmosphere. Yesterday and today again, I think we have that to expect. A lot of dust gets up in the atmosphere and a lot of it settles. It doesn't get flushed out through the soil system. It ends up accumulating, and so we end up with soils that are higher in pH, as primarily, not always, but primarily as a result, or often as a result of accumulations of calcium carbonate, which accumulates in dry areas of the world. Okay, so we have to manage pH, and we can do that. We can manipulate pH to a certain extent, but it's kind of hard to do. Pretty much, unless you've got a lot of money or it's a high-value crop, you're sort of kind of stuck with what you've got. I mean, you can manipulate a little bit, but it's not something that we can say, well, you know, we got a pH of 8, let's just get it down to 7.5. Not always as easy as you would think it would be, because soils are able to buffer changes. I mean, they resist changes in pH. They don't really, I don't want to say they don't really want to, but they resist changing your pH, okay? So again, without getting too deep into that, I just want to sort of tease you on this. So there's a whole lot to understand about soils. There's a whole lot to learn about soils, and each one of these topics, people spend whole careers going down that direction and becoming, you know, soil chemists, for instance. I'm not a soil chemist, but it's a whole career, and it could really, you know, if it's something that you like, it's a direction that's really needed. What else can I talk about here? Salinity. Salinity is a big one in dry areas. What is salinity? It's accumulation of salts in the soil, or it's a soil that's naturally high in salts. Now, one thing I want to say here, a lot of times when we talk about salts, people think of table salt, sodium chloride. Yes, sodium is a component of salinity problems, but it's not the only one, because there's other kinds of salts too that contribute to salinity. Magnesium salts, potassium salts, etc., etc. So one of the things I want to get people to realize is that when you hear the word salts as related to soil, don't automatically think of table salt. Sodium is the worst culprit, and sodium in its various forms is the hardest to overcome in soils. But there's other salts that can cause salinity that can still cause problems with our soils. We can manage those sometimes easier than we can with soils that are high in sodium. It says here saline soils are most common in these arid environments. There's all kinds of things you can do with salinity. Now we have, if any of you are familiar with the Indio and Coachella area where they grow a lot of dates, those soils tend to have salinity issues. Not all of them, but they tend to have salinity issues. Some of that salinity comes from irrigation water. Most of that water is canal water. I think most of it is. Even if they get it out of the groundwater, I think most of that stuff comes from the Colorado, and they pump it back into the groundwater. But the Colorado is not necessarily a super high source of super high quality irrigation water. It is somewhat saline. And you end up using this water over a period of time, you can end up taking a situation where your soils have a little bit of salinity. Maybe it's not that bad, but where you continue to build up the salinity problems. I think Tony's talked to you about irrigation water management a lot, and you probably heard all this before. What you're going to have to do for a situation like that, if you want to grow a high-value crop like dates, and we got the perfect climate in the United States the only climate really where you can do that down there, is that you're going to have to manage those salts. Now, think about what happens if you add a water that's got salt dissolved in it, right? You guys ever get a sore throat and you add the salt in your water? Maybe you don't do that. Maybe that's just me that does that. My mom always said it worked, so I do it whenever I get a sore throat. Add some salt in your water, hot water, and gargle it. Well, you wouldn't want to drink that stuff any more than you'd want to drink the water from out of the ocean. You can't do it. It'd kill you. But what happens if you're adding a salty water to plants? It's causing the same kind of issues. The plant cannot grow in that. It cannot have its functions of actually being able to pull minerals out of water and through its roots and up and actually be able to utilize them if there's salts present. And what if the salts aren't that bad to start with in the water that we're using, but over time we're using the same water that's got a little bit of salt in it? What happens if you left your glass of water that you gargled with? What happens if you left it outside in the hot sun for 2 days? All your water would evaporate. But what would be left? Would you have a nice clean glass? No. It'd be full of salt, right? It'd be all that salt that you dissolved in there, it would probably be caked around the sides and the bottom, but it'd all be right there. Same thing happens in the soil. As water evaporates out of the soil, whatever was dissolved in that water ends up on the top of the soil because it gets pulled to the surface. It's dissolved in the water, gets pulled to the surface by evaporation. The water evaporates, but the salts don't evaporate. Whatever was in that water, dissolved in that water, doesn't evaporate. It ends up on the surface of your soil. Next time you irrigate, what happens? You're adding more and you're flushing that back down. Now your concentration in your soil, probably in that root zone, may be getting higher in salts as a result of that. So how do you overcome a situation like that? Well, there's several things you can do. You can add some chemicals to help that. You can add some acidifying chemicals. That seems to sometimes help. That drops the pH. It makes things drop out of solution. That'll help. But the main thing to do, and what they try to do down in the Indio area when they have these issues, is they try to add a higher quality irrigation water, and they flush it, and they flush it, and they flush it. In other words, they let the water sit on the surface of the soil for several weeks. They just keep adding and maintaining it. What they're trying to do is push all those salts that may be naturally in the soil down below the root zone. They're never going to get rid of them, but they want to push them down below the root zone so that they can grow the dates in relatively salt-free soil. That's a common principle. I mean, you can kind of take that, but that's kind of how we have to manage salinity. We can get more intensive depending on our problems, but that's generally, you got to add a better water than a water that's got less salt in it than your soil's got as far as salt percentage. Okay, let me move on here. Spent too long there. Soil organisms and biology. Okay, it says dirt is dirt and soil has bugs. That's definitely true. The soil is just absolutely full of microbes. Some of those are beneficial, some of them aren't. Most of them are really beneficial. In general, if we didn't have those microbes, we wouldn't have any of the interactions that are going on. A lot of plants rely on microorganisms just to survive. There's relationships between microorganisms and plants that are beneficial to humans indirectly. There's all kinds of stuff. This whole field of soil microbiology is, again, a huge, wide open field. We get medicines out of soil microbes. There's just, I mean, I could go on and on if I knew any more than I did about it, but I don't. But the thing to remember is that if you take into account that microorganisms are super beneficial and we really need them in the soil, then you consider that a handful, even a small handful of soil, pretty much from anywhere in the world, is going to have more microorganisms than we have people on Earth, just in your handful. Okay? That's pretty incredible when you think about that. It's really quite incredible. And so I'm not doing justice to this slide. I apologize for that. But they really do provide huge amounts of benefit in the soils. Okay, I'm going to let that one go. You can tell I'm not a soil microbiologist either. I will tell you a little bit about myself here at the end. Soil organic matter. What is soil organic matter? Pretty much everything that's lived and died in the soil. Okay, so it could be dead bodies of all the microbes. It could be plant material. That's quite common. All the plant material the roots that live and they die, they rot, they decompose, and they are soil organic matter. But there's different forms of soil organic matter. Soil organic matter is very desirable. It helps promote structure. It helps promote porosity. It is a source of some plant nutrients. It's also the food source for most of the microbes because they don't eat dirt. They eat soil organic matter. It's also one of the things that we can lose super easy. Oh, it helps hold water too. It's as far as water holding capacity. Just like if you think about peat moss or some of the additives we use in our potting mixes, they're almost entirely organic matter. One of their primary functions is to hold water, and they do it well. They can hold. I was trying to move a pot over the weekend that looked dry on top. My gosh, I could barely move it. When I finally got the tree out of it that I was transplanting, massive amounts of water in that thing. It's just holding so much water. Okay, soil organic matter is one of the things that's really not well understood when it comes to managing soils. And so there's some slides in here that talk about soil sustainability and practices that you can actually do when you're farming. And a lot of these things are done because people have realized over the last 3 or 4 decades the absolute importance of organic matter to the health of the soil. And you've probably heard a lot of this healthy soil quality and all that kind of stuff, especially in response to, the climate is changing and we need to store carbon and we need to do this. So we hear a lot about soil organic matter in relations to that. But soil organic matter, as I said, as far as its contribution, it doesn't add very much to the soil as far as weight. If we have 5% organic matter in any given layer of the soil, we've really got a lot of organic matter. So in the desert here, naturally, if we have 0.5%, we're really doing good because we just can't really create a lot of organic matter. Why? Go back to the soil forming factors. We need climate. We don't have climate we do have climate. We have too much climate, not enough wet climate. We can't really produce organic matter if you can't grow plants. You can't grow plants if you don't have adequate water. You also have a lot of heat, so whatever organic matter you do produce ends up being volatilized. If it's exposed at the surface, it's not protected, it gets blown away. So this is one of the things that when we get, maybe even the next couple of slides here, when we talk about soil sustainability as far as practices, not disturbing the soils, not turning them over is just super critical. It's super critical to preserve your organic matter. If you guys ever remember hearing, probably again, this might have been 3rd or 4th grade, you heard about the prairies of the United States and the invention of the plow, and that back in the turn of the last century, when the plow was developed, the prairies were turned over and became so productive. Well, what came after that? What came after the production? The Dust Bowl, right? Well, there was more than 2 reasons for that, but one of the reasons is that the plow that they invented basically turned over those heavy soil organic matter rich prairie soils and exposed them to the atmosphere. They volatilized. The atmosphere basically burned them up, if you will, and they disappeared. They kept doing this. It's basically just if they didn't know better. But yeah, they were able to actually grow plants in that because those grassland prairie soils are super fertile naturally because of all the grass roots and the organic matter that had been produced by the grasses over the millennia. But they destroyed a lot of that by flipping them upside down and exposing all that organic matter to the atmosphere. They weren't growing grasses, now they were growing crops where they're taking everything out and not putting things back in. And the next year they came and did the same thing. They turned all those crops upside down, exposed more organic matter, with the result that it didn't take very long before all that material was exposed to the atmosphere. The winds come and it ends up in Washington, D.C., and we have a national disaster. Why don't we have the same thing going on now? Well, partially because we've changed some of our technologies. We've changed some of our methodologies. Are we where we should be? Probably not. If we ever stop developing and growing and looking beyond, we're probably done. But as a species, we need to just keep looking forward and keep trying to say this isn't working or that we could do something better. But what we found, and I think there's some slides here, but I'm afraid I'll lose my train of thought if I go find the slides. But what we found is that disturbing the soil as little as possible is one of the main keys to sustainability. It's not the only one, not by any means, but disturbing it as little as possible. So that means that we got to farm things. And it means that, yeah, well, what happens if I want to eat carrots? Yeesh. We have to get rid of carrots or potatoes. I mean, gosh, I don't know how Americans would live without potatoes. But you got to disturb the soil to get those out. So what about that kind of stuff? Are we supposed to stop eating certain kinds of foods? No, not at all. But you have to, again, understand soils, understand that there are some soils that will take abuse, in a sense, more than others. You plant the appropriate crops there. And it just so happens that carrots and potatoes, sugar beets are another one, they don't mind sandy soils. As a matter of fact, the people who grow them would rather have a sandy soil. Why is that? It's easier to get the things out of the ground. They're not stuck in there, and they clean off easier. Well, sandy soils don't really mind being disturbed because they're not really very highly developed soils anyways. Perfect for that. But you wouldn't want to perhaps use a high value another crop that wouldn't. Well, let me say that different. You wouldn't want to put potatoes or sugar beets or some crop that really intensively disturbs the soil to harvest it in an area where the soil can't handle that, where you'd have to destroy the soil to do that, where you have good structure on the soil. Sandy soils don't have good structure because remember the analogy of marbles in your hand. You can roll the marbles around any way you want, they're still just marbles in your hand, right? That's kind of like a sandy soil. Yeah, it has some structure, but not like a good clay soil. So you're limited in what you can do with sandy soils anyways. But if you tailor your crops to your soils, then you can minimize your disturbance. And that really is the key. You want to maintain your organic matter because it's critical in fertility, it's critical for water holding capacity, for porosity, all those kinds of things. You want to do that. Don't disturb your soils. Just keep them covered as much as you can throughout the year. Don't turn them over any more than you need to. When you need to, you do, but you minimize it. I think that's really the key there. And again, we can zip through. Oh, here we go. We can zip through some of these pictures and talk about them, some of the different slides. But I think that's what I want to communicate to everybody. It's really not. Soils is really something that I think we all sort of intuitively know if we care at all about what the world around us. We kind of know these things. It's just like maybe somebody hasn't really told us. We just haven't really thought about it. But we kind of know that. You look around and you go out and you buy 5 acres in the desert, and the first thing you do, not you guys, but somebody does, is come in and clean it all off so it's got no creosote bushes or nothing. Why do we do that? Well, because everybody else does it, and that's where we need to break the mold. Everybody else does that. Why do people farm the way they did back in the 20s and the 30s? Because that's how people are doing it. So what we want to do is we want to think outside that box. We don't want to just do what other people are doing because that's what other people are doing. The key to not doing what other people are doing as far as soils is concerned is to understand what soils are. As we've said, how they're formed, how you manage them, what you should do, what you shouldn't do based on what you want to do with them to maintain their longevity, to not just to maintain it, although that's critical to the quality that they have, but to maybe improve their quality, because we can use soils and it doesn't mean that we have to degrade them. It doesn't mean that just because we're using them, they're going to get worse. No, we can actually improve them. We can put inputs into them, and if we manage them well, we can actually improve what we've got. So Mother Nature can do it well, but we can use her principles, and we can maintain that. And in some cases, we might even be able to do a little bit better using those principles. Okay. Okay. Alrighty. How much time do I have?
Probably about another 5.
Oh, okay. Let's see, what can we do here? It won't be as fun as listening to me. You guys think, yeah, it will. We can turn the online off. Let's talk about. Let's see what I can talk about now. Well, I kind of said some of this kind of stuff. Let's talk about cover crops. This kind of goes along with what I was actually talking about. Disturb your soils as little as possible. We're talking more agricultural related or whatever. Because if you're going to build on them, you have to disturb them. I understand that. But if we're talking about sustainability, we keep that topic in mind. Cover crops. I would say cover crops are really good because they protect the soil. They cover the soil. Like I said, why do you want to go out in the desert and clear everything? The wind can now pick up all those particles that are loose, blow them all over the place. Plus, you've lost your whole biology component. your roots are dying now in the soil. You say, oh yeah, but they're producing organic matter. Yeah, but that's going to be gone because there's nothing to sustain them. You're not adding anything to it. You have to have this input and output cycling for soils to maintain their health and their productivity. And you can't do that by just clear cutting. So that's one of the things. Think outside the box. Don't just do what other people do. Minimize your disturbance of the soil. We have a lot of tools out now that actually do that, what we call no-till, conservation tillage, minimum till. Basically, these tools are designed to minimize damage to the soil. If you can leave the old residue from the previous crop out there and you can have a machine that has a wheel that cuts through all that residue and then puts a seed in behind it, hey, that's great because you've got the roots are still in the soil. You haven't turned up the organic matter. Things are living and dying. I mean, yeah, you might cut through a few worms right through there, but by and large, a vast population of worms is pretty happy because you didn't disturb them. And the worms don't like that. Cover crops and just keeping your soil covered. So I'm going to use cover crops there, not just to talk about them in particular, but just to keep your soil covered. In the desert, it's really critical that we do that as well. But all over the country, California, we've heard all the news about California and the drought and all this. And then University of California suddenly came up with this thing that some people have known for quite a while, because universities are often, and the government, us, we're kind of like slow to the game. But farmers realize it. Keep the soil covered, put a mulch or something on the soil, and you can actually end up using less water. Well, that doesn't make any sense. You mean I'm going to grow a cover crop and it's going to take water? I'm going to actually save water and use less water? Yeah, absolutely. Because the benefits of having your soil covered, slowing your evaporation, maintaining your water in there, are going to overcome what little moisture that crop might use to get established and grow. Novel idea, you'd think, but no, some people have known that for millennia. It's just that we forget, because we forget to think outside the box. We just kind of do what everybody else does. So keep your soil covered and don't disturb it. Whatever principles and whatever things you can do that will do that, will keep your soil covered and disturb it as little as possible, will help maintain your sustainability. And I mean, that sounds pretty simple, but really, it is that simple. It really is that simple. That doesn't mean that you're gonna suddenly be able to make the desert bloom like the Garden of Eden, but to maintain productivity, to maintain sustainability, that's basically where you need to start. I know there's a lot of other things on here. What else can I say? There's the minimum till stuff. I saw this one here. This is interesting. If you've not seen that TED Talk by Alan Savory, it's kind of interesting. He basically says that if you have a whole bunch of animals and you move them around, lots of animals like herd animals, like you see on TV, the plains of Africa and all that, the savannas, how those animals are all kind of moving around. He's saying if you do that, all the dung and the litter and everything from those animals is actually going to be, it's going to get into the soil eventually. And that you're adding organic matter to the surface. Yes, sir. I'm done? Okay. And that's going to help fertilize the soils, but you're also, I can't remember all the way the talk, it's been a while since I watched it, but it was a really interesting idea that by keeping animals off of our lands, we're actually maybe doing the lands a disservice. Because he's looking at, they did experience, he's looking at adding animals back to the land, but managing them. Lots of animals, but move them around. And that's actually been shown to increase the productivity, that's the word I'm looking for, and the quality of the land. Go ahead.
So to add into that, that link, that video, just look it up under YouTube. You should really watch it before you go on the trip. Some of the stuff we're really going to tie together happens on the trip. So we're going to go out to 12 grams. We'll start out at 12 grams. He's doing exactly this method. It's actually called intensive grazing. You actually graze very intensive for periods. And we'll be talking about how that actually improves the grass and how us here in the Mojave pulling cattle off the range can actually shows that very clearly. People all over the world are doing this now. It's just time for us in the Mojave to catch up to Earl Graham has. And so we're going to be visiting that and actually talking about that on the site. So to get the most out of this class, before you go on the field trip, definitely watch this. And then I'll also be pointing out a couple of other videos and lecture. Like next year, we're going to talk about animal production in general, and that's when I'm going to highlight the issue of fine feeding operations, feedlot feeding, and nitrates in the water. So next week's PowerPoint we'll go to see it out in the field. So this is a new kind of a class that you're also part of, where the field study component kind of bring it to life. That's what that field trip's all about. I just wanted to throw that in.
I can stop at any time, or I can go for 2 more hours.
Yeah, I think that's
Right? Right?
very perfect.
Some of you guys?
Does anybody have one question? Here, I'll shut it down.
Gotta have one question.
How do you get your job?
Oh, I can tell you about that. Yeah, I work for Natural Resources Conservation Service. I'm a soil scientist, as Neville said. I first of all started off doing soil surveys, which is pretty much mapping the soil, the land surfaces, and determining where the different soils were, so that we could know how to manage them better. Now what I am is I'm more of like a resource person, so I help, I kind of answer soil problems. Oh yeah, sorry about that. I answer soil problems. I work with farmers, I work with the communities, sometimes we work with other units of government, other federal agencies. If you have a problem, then I try to help you to solve it soils-wise. So I'm a soils resource person right now. I went to school in agronomy, no less, and I ended up in this job many years ago because I had a professor who was a soils professor, and he says, you know what, this agency is hiring. You should check them out. So I actually did that, and long story short, that's how I got where I am today. And someone actually kind of pointed me in that direction. Yes.
So I'm an ag major, so if I take all these classes and go try to find what other kind of jobs I don't know.
Well, right now, unfortunately, because of our new administration, nobody's getting hired. But that's the way it always happens. It's up and down. A lot of what we do, you can be a soil scientist. That is coming back. For a while, they sort of fell out of favor. People thought, we know all there is to know about soils, we're kind of done. But what we do a lot of is soil conservation work. So there's a lot of soil conservationists. You're pretty much working with farmers to help them conserve their natural resources.
And like, how much schooling do you need? Not
Bachelor's degree. A bachelor's degree. Yeah.
Could I just add that this stuff and biology department and private foundation, unfortunately, pretty much an obligated town, and so it opens up that I job might not be full science subject, but it will be land and right. So Tony, for example, now part of it really is land and yes, irrigation for the management fish, but it's all about land management and that field. And when I present this pathway have to go look at jobs, one place to go get into, get paid, learn life, and great place. Right guys, thanks a lot. Everybody real quick, everybody put a yes in red, a circle. I'm going to take that as gospel. I'll be turning that in this week. As long as it's over there with the other distance. And we'll be good. See you next week. If you're going over the other place, my other class in way, I'll be there in about 10 minutes. Oh, somebody else not had a chance to pull it up? If it's on there and you remember filling out a form, then Coming. Okay, cool. Thank you. It makes it better to have one right back. That's Tony Bowles.
It must have been tough to compress like all of that.